Okay, let's get started. We're going to have a second trial run, I suppose, with our audio today. Welcome everyone to our Kaysville City Planning Commission for tonight. We will start the meeting with the opening and approval of minutes from the meeting on September 12th, 2019. Someone want to make a motion? Is that on? And the green light doesn't mean anything.
I'll make a motion.
Okay. Is there a second?
I'll second it.
And we'll start with Tammy. Aye.
Aye.
And we'll also excuse Quan. I think he is on his way, so we will have 5 of us here. Okay, the next item on our agenda is a conditional use permit for a 2-family dwelling. Or excuse me, no, I'm skipping one. Let's go back to the second item on the agenda, which is a public hearing for an amendment to the Kaysville City General Plan. Lyle, you want to fill us in?
Thank you, Mr. Commissioner Sunloff. I'd be happy to get you up to speed. And again, anyone behind me who can't hear from the mic, please shout at me and I'll stand up or something if I can face everybody. But as the Commission is aware, we've been talking for some time, in particular regarding housing choices and moderate income housing plan and some of the elements that the state of Utah has required that cities update to come in compliance with Senate Bill 34. So we've had discussion as a commission regarding that over a few meetings. We've attempted to do some public outreach to get input as to what makes sense for the residents of the city. And I'll just briefly go through these, but this is some of the data that we have been over in a previous meeting that represented what we heard from the residents, primarily through our online survey, but also open house and the correspondence that we've taken place through that. Effectively, what it shows is residents felt that they were interested in, let me show the maps. These are some of the easiest. They like the single-family nature of Kaysville primarily, and so some of the suggestions and items that we'd asked about and talked about were a small lot, single-family type development versus townhomes versus apartments. Do we look at accessory dwelling units? Do we mix? Do mixed-use type development as we're looking at new options of housing choices within Kaysville. And so again, small lot single family stood out among those. Accessory dwelling units was highly popular with the respondents that we received as an item that was interest of consideration. But it also showed that even townhome type development or some of the more dense applications had a place, primarily near businesses, on perimeters of neighborhoods, major streets. So this indicates that a little bit with some of, again, the results that we received, this map in particular showing apartments. When we looked at the choices, it's not represented as much within the survey data we gathered, so we could go into these further. But the state of Utah, essentially with their legislation, said you got a pick list of 24 items, I believe it is. You have to have at least 3 of these implemented into your general plan and start considering them as a city. So this just highlights some of them that we'd previously identified as a commission and some of the reason we catered the survey and questions the way we did to find out a little bit what people felt about these options. So tonight we're, as far as procedure, we've noticed and advertised for the public hearing on the general plan. And so that would be what we're here to receive input on this evening. Part of that, we sent out information to, they call them the affected entities, other taxing entities that work within Kaysville City. And of that, I've only received one comment from Davis Weber Canal Company, and their thinking was simply that as the city's thinking about new development and changes, that they ought to be smart about how that impacts water use over time. So primarily for them, more concrete really helps their system in some ways, but it's not necessarily that, it's just how it's used. So they're not concerned on the number of units, the number of bodies, or what they're in. But as we're thinking about changes, that we would take that into consideration to see if we can improve, as we're in a desert, how we utilize water. What you have here in the packet accomplishes a few things. It's at least just a draft suggestion, a starting point for conversation, trying to kind of capture some of the comments or highlights I think that the outreach and survey results proposed. Essentially, making a few tweaks to just a few pages of our general plan, where we would change the allowed density within different sections of the city. Currently west of I-15 at 0 to 2 units an acre, with some additional density on major streets. My suggestion was to increase that from 0 to 4 units per acre, and then to be specific on what that density might look like. So the 10 unit per acre was something that's more reflective of a townhome type development along major streets. And again, it's an option, it's a general plan, commission, and ultimately the council. You can interpret that. Beyond that, this is a suggestion. So that's more comments from the public, and then your input. Ultimately, we'll try and craft something that you'll forward as a recommendation to the commission, likely in November. So that's one example. You see something similar east of I-15. It demonstrates a higher density number. Again, it gets specific on it. It is higher than the west side of the freeway. Again, that's based off of kind of the way people pick spots on the map. And we'll let you craft that if you feel that's appropriate to be more distinct that way. I think those are the highlights on that page. Just to speak to this one, a change. So another part of this is cities are now required to have an active transportation element in the general plan. So we have an active transportation plan. It's pretty robust. It's recent. I think it's good. This simply takes away referring to a plan, and it will include it as part of it. And then the last part is the moderate income element itself. So I just took a couple, I'm pretty sure they're verbatim from SB 34 and plugged them in here, essentially addressing accessory dwelling units as an option, talking about densities that would be appropriate for moderate income development, and then preserve existing moderate income housing, I believe is an item we had discussed as a commission. We doing okay here on the sound? I'm not looking behind me, so I'm assuming we're all right.
Some are saying they can't hear.
Okay. That's...
I think because Lyle's facing us, we can hear a little better. And I think with the video, it picks it up, but the echo really hurts when you're sitting in here.
Okay.
Is that... We're hearing, yes.
Okay.
Well, I am.
I'll get creative here and speak. Okay. So this is just the last image that I have on this, and then we'll turn it over to the commission for comments. Is this sort of better projecting towards everyone? But this is just simply to show we do have an active transportation plan. Your packet included the entirety of it. It's something like 180 pages. It's extremely extensive and lengthy. But again, just to indicate what we have on there, and that's where you see our trails that we're building, bike lanes that we've been striping recently, and that kind of element. So that, I think, should be the lowest, very easy to check a box of what we're required to do. And then to the commission and your prerogative to kind of direct moving forward. I think as staff, we felt that tonight would be a good time to take in additional comments, whether or not you feel to respond to those or dive into any further conversation would be up to you. But I think we will take at least the next 2 meetings in October to vet it out and go into the details as a commission and respond to the comments or questions that have heard from this public hearing. So with that, I will conclude my comments unless you have questions from me, and remind you to open the public hearing.
Any questions before we start the public hearing?
But maybe just the question about like the difference between the zoning from the east and the west, you know, the proposed change there. I mean, I know it's already currently that way, that there's a difference between the two, but I'm just wondering, like, you know,
Do we need to switch one?
So for the differences between the east and the west, I know it currently is that way, but I'm just curious, like, for situations like we have, let's say that 200 North is considered a main road, then is that, introduce kind of weird situations where you could have, similar housing developments that could be on both sides, but now we're not going to allow that because we're going to have differences in the zoning.
So I'll repeat the question. Hopefully this mic picks up a little bit and hope it'll make sure I understand correctly, but also for those to hear. So the question is essentially the way that the draft is proposed, it continues to show a density distinction between east and west. And I believe Commissioner Barris, and please correct me, that you're curious as to whether or not that's an appropriate thing to consider going forward, especially where certain streets, 200 North, for example, traverse both sides of the city. I think it's subjective, and we've heard people say, it ought to be equal, spread everything out citywide, treat the city equally, don't split us in half. Others are showing they don't think density belongs on one side and not the other. So I feel as a commission, if you think it should be treated more equally, east to west, certainly that's appropriate to make that recommendation to the city council for their decision. If that addresses that, that's just fine. And again, just to reiterate, I apologize, Commissioner Sunloff, cutting you off, but mine is simply the way I looked at how the data showed, but that's my interpretation of it. So you may look at the same data and say, people are saying we want this everywhere, so I'm not going to be hurt personally either from a different recommendation. So I think you could look at it, for your own merit and see what you think is appropriate.
Okay, thank you. So let me see if I can recap or explain what we're doing right now. So we're going to have a public hearing, which means any one of you can come up here and to the mic, the podium right here, state your name, and give us your comments about this amendment to the general plan. And just to, I guess, summarize a little bit of what was said, this amendment to the general plan is really driving at implementing what the state legislature is requiring of us as a city. They said essentially that big long list of criteria that Lyle put up there, we have to choose 3 of those as a city to implement into our general plan, and we have to do it by the end of the year. And so we've had some conversations in previous meetings. Now we want to hear from you all. So I'm going to open the public hearing. If you are here to speak to this, please come up. If you are here for another item and you want to speak to this, please come up. And because I'm assuming not very many of you are here for this item, we won't put a time limit. But if someone says something that you were going to say and they've already said it, just say I agree with that and give your point. So we will open the public hearing.
Testing.
Is anyone here to speak on this item? Okay, please come up.
I kind of ended up following along almost by happenstance, so it's been quite a journey. Sorry, Michael Halls, 75 South, West Kaysville. It's been kind of a journey. It's been interesting learning about SB 34, the plan for the state of Utah to basically make it possible for my kids to eventually be able to live in Utah. I agree with the principles in it, and really, honestly, I'm glad to see that Utah is kind of looking towards the future when we have 300,000 more residents in Davis County, and they got to live somewhere. Just a couple of things that I would like to see kind of incorporated into the general plan. I think Kaysville has kind of a unique history. I don't see anything in the general plan that is really kind of addressing some of these historical areas. I think this is a great opportunity to look at how to utilize some of our historic districts to keep their character, but to also be able to use and develop them in a way that encourages us dwellings for moderate income. One other thing, just to remind the Planning Commission about why the original general plan had lower density in Kaysville. If you go out and you look at the earthquake liquefaction maps, the areas in East Kaysville are moderate. The areas in West Kaysville, because they sit effectively on fill from the Great Salt Lake, are very high. So if density, especially larger apartment buildings and other stuff, do come into West Kaysville, it means the impact of what eventually will happen, which is an earthquake, will be have an impact on more people. The other one is all city services in terms of emergency services are also on the east side of Kaysville. The fire department, the police department, that is on the east side because of it. And then the other part of it is, if you guys who were around in 1980 remember, the Great Salt Lake was not always where it was. And there will be a 100-year flood. A lot of the homes that are now out west or to the far west actually would have been underwater during that time. So Legacy may change that in terms of creating some kind of a breakwater in some ways. But it's also a good idea to kind of think, what do we really want in West Kaysville in terms of preparing for that eventuality. So, thank you.
Thank you. Anyone else feel inclined to speak to this item? Going once. Okay. We will close the public hearing and have discussion, I guess, amongst the commission. And before we do that, let me just say, so my understanding, and maybe Lyle, you can correct me if I'm wrong, we can have a discussion based on, just some proposed language as you went through. We can talk about maybe the active transportation plan. That does, I agree, seem like low-hanging fruit. So we don't have to, in fact, we're probably not going to be doing any type of action. We're just having a discussion about proposals and maybe pushing off to a future meeting. Is that right?
Yeah, that would be correct. So we would be looking as staff, if you're ready this evening, to give direction that we could prepare you with more information for upcoming conversation. Based on the way we've noticed this already with the Clipper, that's expected that we would be before the City Council on, I think it's November the 7th, I want to say, is their first meeting, and we can adjust that if we're not ready by then, but I also, just to indicate, I don't think there's a rush to make that recommendation, is that's when they would consider it. So discussion's appropriate, direction to us is appropriate. If you really feel that this is fantastic and perfect, then go ahead and you're welcome to make a recommendation. But I think we would expect likely simple direction or conversation to help inform future meetings and what information we can provide for you.
So let me start with my own question, I guess. So, Lyle, we've had discussions about correct me if I'm wrong, actually. We've had discussions about overhauling the entire general plan and not just making an amendment that we're talking about today. So is that still the case? And this is just an amendment that may be totally revamped with a bigger change in the relatively near future?
Yeah, I think that's a great question and comment. So we have received grant funding from WFRC, the regional planning organization, to help us with a big overhaul of our general plan. And so I'm expecting come start the 1st of 2020, we will begin that process. I've begun some of the process we need to start looking at and getting consultants on board to help us with that. And so this certainly could be more robust. I think our general plan has need for a lot more robust information and land use maps and such that we've discussed over time as the commission. This simply keeps us in compliant with a deadline for the state, takes what we really need to look at right now, and yes, we do hope to get a bigger, broad picture of our general plan and take a look at the rest of the elements in the near future.
Okay. Any comments, discussion, questions?
Okay, I have a question. I know that we're addressing units per acre, and that height is addressed in different ordinances. Is that also addressed somewhere in this general plan where, so that we can say, okay, we don't want any structure, housing structure to be X high or X amount of floors or?
It may be in there. If it is, it's not stated so specifically that height of the building shall be 30 feet or whatever the number is, and perhaps I'm wrong with that. The ordinances themselves, as you alluded to, or where that's determined more specifically. A general plan could be a location where it would say Kaysville City is a low-profile community. Well, maybe that comes out wrong, but does not have tall structures, and again, to give out a general feeling of what you would like to see. Or it could state the opposite, that most of Kaysville City would sit below a tree canopy, but in certain areas we want to see something beat the Burj Khalifa in Dubai as the tallest building in the world, right? So you could set a vision and a plan for what you'd like to see, generally how you'd like to see it, and even where you could get specific as to where you think those things belong, should you decide to see that.
Okay.
And so specific to housing, if you think that's necessary to maybe accommodate this, that we start letting a little bit more height, we could allude to that here in the general plan. Last maybe comment I'll make on this question is the way I see our progress moving forward on updating these items. We'll do this specific element of the general plan in the immediate future, dealing with it now. A big overhaul of the general plan through 2020, and they can be several month-long processes. Once that's done, our ordinances are going to need some significant update and changing to fulfill the goals of that updated general plan. And so we could, we'll also get to the ordinances, I guess is what I'm getting at, to get very specific on those heights and other details.
Okay. Okay, thanks. And then my second question was, Michael mentioned historic districts, and I know that that's part of the general plan, Main Street's historic kind of thing, but are we going to put more detail in it in terms of redevelopment areas and preserving historical areas?
So currently I've not proposed any changes that speak to that directly. We can, as part of this task, if that's something that you wish us to do or you want to provide more direction for that. Absolutely, as part of the bigger general plan overhaul, I think those will be items that will be addressed.
Okay.
Go ahead.
Anyway, sorry. That the west side zoning was originally was because of earthquake and to prevent that from being an issue for higher density. Is that really the reason? Can you confirm that that's the reason?
You're going to get a guess from me. So it's been in our general plans of similar language for 30 years, alluding to low density housing types west of I-15. That could be a component of it, the liquefaction, and there are different soil types. So I always joke with people, you're either on a fault or you're in high liquefaction, so hopefully you've been living right kind of thing. I can't speak directly if that's why they chose to put that in there or not. I assume it's one of many options. What I've heard more, I couldn't give you a source, but just from different people, is more to preserve the agrarian type feel that when it was incorporated into Kaysville City in the mid-'80s, or annexed into Kaysville City, they were essentially farms out west, and they wanted to kind of keep that feel. And as developments come along, they've tried to keep that a little bit by keeping the larger lot and less density, just based on historic use, as that's how it developed, was lower density than the original town site of Kaysville. So if I'm guessing, I think it had a little bit more to do with that, but that doesn't automatically mean those other factors weren't taken into consideration, just that it's been on the books for a long time.
Because could you mitigate some of that risk just by the building standards that you had for that area, instead of zoning, to have it be like the standard of the building itself?
Yeah, sure. The risk would always be there, and again, I think there's risk on most properties, no matter what. But building code, building standards, and how you deal with that can be part of the mitigation of what you choose to put there. So they're such large-scale event, though, and the impact, depending on whatever hits us, and we're all waiting for the great shakeout, or what it's called, that maybe under a small-scale earthquake, things could be mitigated, but if something hits hard enough, it's going to affect everybody, probably no matter where you're at.
Okay. And then my final question is, with the 10 units per acre on the allowed for the west side, would that impact our ability to approve like mixed-use type housing on the west side?
That's a great question. So, mixed use will be a new animal for us, I think. Currently in Kaysville City's ordinances, and more where that's derived from, our R2 zoning designation is essentially 10 unit per acre. Our highest density is the RM, and that's about 15 units an acre. And we're still primarily seeing single family attached or townhome type development under those densities. So if you can think of a couple, right behind Vasa currently is one that is essentially 15 units an acre. It's just right about there. You could incorporate commercial development into that. Commissioner Tran's question comes into play. Where would you put it? You probably would have to go vertical to add yet another element into it, or you have smaller units. So we're not necessarily seeing density in small units. They're probably 2,500 square foot single-family homes plus garage. So if you had a 900 square foot single-bed apartment, then yes, you could make that density work with commercial use. Most communities where you see it are probably closer to the 25 units an acre when they're doing a mixed-use development. They're pretty intense. They're putting storefronts and retail on the bottom and typically apartments on top. It probably breaches and goes beyond the densities that we currently allow. So we could consider new zones that go beyond what we currently have.
Okay.
So based upon what you just said, in order to do that, to do a mixed-use area or to develop a mixed-use area, it would have to be on a rezone request, and we'd have to create an ordinance for that, right?
Yeah, so we have pretty clearly within our ordinances, you're either commercial or residential. There are some provisions, and I've been looking over our central commercial district in particular that actually allow for some single family, but is far from clear on how much, what that looks like. And so my take is, yes, if we want to allow it, we need to create an ordinance that accommodates it and then select where that would be permitted.
And so within this general plan amendment, a mixed-use ordinance allowing higher density would be okay, even though it says up to X amount of, units per acre?
Yeah, and so the market may push back on it with it, and perhaps that's some of the homework we can do for you is reach out a little bit to the development community. What does it take to make mixed use work? I wish I could say I was more expert on it. I have been part of some projects, but my understanding from the development community is if commercial works in a location, then mixed use can. But if commercial wasn't going to work to begin with, mixed use is very difficult. And so adding rooftops and customers to support those is crucial. And so that's where the high densities come into play is if they weren't there to begin with to have enough demographic and spending power, and Commissioner Lyon will have some in on this, then it wouldn't work. So Kaysville's mixed use could be unique to us, and it may work, but we could do some more homework on that. And
So just looking at some projects around the county and in Salt Lake County, you typically have to have the retail, but then you have the rooftops. But there's three elements that usually play into it. You have transit, retail, and then the housing. And so without those three elements, typically a project won't work. And so you've got to have, like he says, the rooftops to support the retail, and then typically there's a transit. So you go over to Layton and look at right next off of Layton Parkway. They have that building there. They built that with less than 0.85 parking spaces. So usually you build an apartment building with 2 parking spaces. They build it with 0.85. So there's less than 1 parking space per unit there. And it's very successful because it's on the transit line. And then you have the retail that's all very close. They can access very rapidly. And the other one that you look at is down in Sugar House Park, down on 11th East and 21st South. That's very successful also, but it's on a transit line. Majority of the people that live there work between 106 South and Utah County, but they all take the train down. And so they built that one also with less than, I think, 0.75 parking spaces per unit. And so you have to get that mix right, and you have to get the transit with it too. So it is that mix, working in the space with developers. You have to figure out the right project, right place, and the right elements there. But it can work and work well and with the cities and the right population. And it also depends on what you want to attract to your city.
And maybe a direction we could take, commissioners, if we're super specific in the general plan, that may hurt us moving forward when we find out, yeah, we need 15, 20, 30, I don't know what the number would be. So I know the direction in the past has been, our general plan is so brief and so generic, probably to a detriment, or that it can be looked at so many ways. So you're playing that balance of how specific do you get that you can't be flexible, or how generic do you leave it so that you can. And again, we can amend these and change these. It's doable. Ultimately, it just comes down to our ordinances and how they reflect this. And so if you give at least clear guidance on what those ordinances become, find the balance. And again, we look to you and appreciate your participation on it to strike the right point.
So this is good discussion. It's good to have, but I think it's probably mostly applicable to when we do our bigger overhaul for the general plan. So let me try to bring us back to what this amendment is about and the red lines that we have in the packet. So I'll just start. We've already touched on it a little bit, but what are your thoughts on the red lines to, I guess, Section 1 housing, where it's saying, as a general rule, 0 to 4 units per acre instead of 2, up to 10 units per acre along major streets, and then on the east side up to 16 units. Those are just proposed numbers. We don't have to stay with those. We can go up or down. But is there any specific comments about that or reactions to that?
I think, is having been through general plan revision for another county, these need to be updated occasionally. Needs change in communities, and I think it's good to go through and look at this and see where you have to be, and statutorily we've got to move the ball. And I think, as a city, we've got to take a look at this. I think the work that Lyle's done, the work we've done, we've kind of got a feel for what the citizens want. I think this is kind of the direction we're going to have to move because of SB 34. But I think it's a good place to start. I like the numbers. I think it's within a fair balance of what needs to happen.
Other thoughts? I suppose putting numbers in is not inherently bad, but like Lyle said, it limits us. If for some reason we wanted to, for example, go more than 10 units or more than 16 units, or someone who's opposed to that would be wanting to say, no, it should be a lot less, which, by the way, now's the time to make that argument, but and we have crickets out there. But nevertheless, we can keep the numbers, we can change the numbers, they do pigeonhole us a little bit. Okay, so the other red lines we saw in terms of just general reactions, the transportation plan is just, we have this great transportation plan, active transportation plan, that we just, whatever the word is, created. So we can incorporate that and say, let's start implementing the strategies that came from that plan. I don't know that that seems pretty logical, but is there other discussion on that point? Okay, all y'all people, listen. Project, be clear. Okay. Well, thank you for the comment. We'll try to.
Okay, is this better? Okay, sorry. Okay, so I have a comment not about the active transportation plan, but I had someone ask me, they said, okay, you're revamping your general plan as the city. Can you guarantee that, can you set the prices to make sure that the housing is affordable? And I said, no, we can't do that. The only way I guess the city can really do that is to allow a builder or developer to build higher density, right? Because not that we want that, I'm not saying we do, but in order to meet those goals, because what we're seeing is moderate housing coming in at really expensive prices. So that's just a question that someone asked me, and I thought it was a good point.
Yeah, I mean, I'll just offer my thoughts. We have to, what I think SB 34 is driving at is we need to create an environment where, quote unquote, affordable housing can come. We don't get to dictate that kind of stuff, but we can create the situation where it's more likely to occur. And I think, in my own personal opinion, we need to do better at that in Kaysville. And you know, we've had opportunities recently that I think we haven't taken the best advantage of. And there's two sides to that argument. I understand. That's just my side. So this is kind of trying to force us to, from the state legislature, to make those changes as best we can in our local context. So, other comments? And then I guess the last little red line part would be the three, and I think, correct me if I'm wrong, Lyle, you proposed three of the multiple criteria that you just plugged in based on the comments that we've had here, and then from the citizens we've heard with the open houses. These are the three that you picked, right?
Correct. So, you'd be welcome to add more, and you may argue that we could remove one if some of the prior language accommodated one of those options already.
So just to be clear, we're saying accessory dwelling units, creating that as a goal, higher density, and possibly mixed use zones, higher density in mixed use and a mixed use zone and near commercial centers, employment centers, and then preserve existing moderate income housing. I think we can meet that last one. Again, maybe we're about done with this discussion, but this notion of affordability or moderate income, I guess, is the better approach. But affordable housing is relative because, you know, as these recent examples that I'm talking about, I think the price points we're going to be like mid 300s, and that's now what's affordable in Kaysville. So it is a relative term. We're only going to be able to try to foster so much of an environment to bring the prices or the affordability down, short of doing more drastic things like incentivizing or subsidizing development or housing, which I don't think we talked about very much. But if you don't do that, you're only going to be able to get the prices so low. Okay, any other discussion? Go on.
Thank you. So it kind of goes back to what you were saying before, which was, do we put in numbers but then the potential side effect of that is we're pigeoning ourselves. But it sounds like I myself agree with what you're saying, which is we want affordable housing. How do we define affordable housing? Is it in the 200? Is it in the 300? It'd be nice if it were in the 200. That would be great. But then I think it goes back to, if that's our goal, what's it going to take for a developer, and what's the density? And we've heard in the past, okay, if you allow me to do this, it's going to take so many units, here's the price point. We've heard that. So maybe goes back to what you're saying about these numbers that we're putting in. We should be cognizant of the market forces.
Okay, well, I think we'll revisit this discussion. And is there going to be other opportunities for public input, Lyle?
You're welcome to encourage it. We've met the statutory requirement as far as the public hearing. But yes, they will be all held at public meetings. If you would like us to word it such on the agenda so the public knows or do additional outreach, that they're welcome to continue involved in that way, you're sure welcome to do that. You can always go above and beyond the amount of comments you're receiving above the minimum. If you think something outside of the meeting is still necessary, we could discuss that as well and find other ways to collect information if you feel that's appropriate.
Okay.
Last comment on this. So what you're saying is, if we wanted to engage the public a little bit more on this issue, because I'd really like to know what people think. I really would. I mean, I kind of know what I think, but I'd like to know how people actually feel. I know nobody wants affordable housing next door. I get that. But so are you saying that we could have open houses or another public hearing, or what are you saying that we can do to?
Well, I'm saying you could. So with the time constraint we have, we'll be a little bit limited on how much we can do. So I don't know for certain that the city council is going to adopt it the first time they see it. I mean, if we've done a good job thoroughly vetting it through, they may. So that's where I'm hoping in November to do it. They're often out, not holidays and such during the month of December. There aren't always very many meetings to get it on. So we do have this time constraint where the state's saying by the end of by December 30th, I believe it is 2019. It might even be December 1st, actually, 2019. We should have something adopted. So that said, we can continue. We've done one open house already. We've done online surveys and outreach, and we've been kind of gauging the waters with the strategic planning process a little bit as we talk about housing with people. But yeah, we're welcome to do more than that. We can have more hearings here with the Planning Commission. We would take your direction. Just know we're within that time constraint. And maybe to reiterate, we don't want to get it wrong per se, but we can improve on it and get it better during the major overhaul we'll be working at, so we can continue to get additional information. And even as much as this has need for revision, we've been every 5 years, 3 to 5 years or so, the city does do it. And so we will constantly see changes to this where we don't always get it right the first time. We can continue on it. Just so happens this go around, we know right on the tail end of this, we're going to be right back in this conversation.
Okay. Let's go to our next agenda item, which is, I believe, a preliminary plat, a public hearing and a preliminary plat for the Green Manor subdivision. Oh, sorry, the conditional use permit. Okay, thank you for directing me. Okay, rewind. Conditional use permit for a 2-family dwelling at 188 North, 650 East for Dustin Parker. Lyle.
Thank you, Commissioner. I'm just going to look at one note, and then I know many of the public who are here this evening are here for this item. And so I just wanted to check on a square footage, then I will stand over there and hopefully speak to them. Okay. So since I think many are here for this, so the property here on the corner of where we have 5th, 6th East, sorry, 5th and 200 North, it's actually 650 East right on the corner. That's an existing single-family dwelling. The owner of it has expressed interest in converting it to a 2-family dwelling. So in the existing zoning designation, it's primarily single-family dwellings by permitted use. However, it does allow for 2-family dwellings as a conditional use, thus they're here before the Planning Commission this evening. The way it reads is so long as there are not more than 2 additional duplexes within 500 feet of this duplex. And so what this map indicates is the location of that. We've looked in our records within a 500-foot radius for additional legal duplexes of record or twin home, whatever configuration. It appears that there are only the 2, so this could be permitted as the 3rd. What the property owner is proposing to do, I'm trying to recognize faces, I don't know if he's here this evening, is essentially it's a basement apartment or basement unit. So they've got the one unit upstairs. They're hoping to do some construction and remodel on the bottom floor. It's about 960 square feet of space. They would have a stairwell on the east side or the back of the home for access into it, and proposing a driveway on the north side of the property so that residents in one unit could park on one side and residents in the other unit could park on the south side. It's about the detail that you have. It's a city street. As far as the drive access here, it's not highly detailed, but we believe, and there's a note in there, we would keep them at least a minimum distance from the intersection, and I think they can meet that and provide an appropriate driveway. Typically, we have 2 parking spaces per unit, and so these would be long enough that you can meet at least that minimum standard. As the conditional use permit, just as a reminder for the commission, again, it's a use that we've, within our ordinance specified, is permitted. However, you're looking to see if there are any detrimental impacts that you can mitigate that require additional conditions. Often we see traffic as one of those. There may be others that you find are necessary to pose specific requirements on this in order to mitigate those impacts. And, we find often it's not eliminate, but mitigate, I think, is a key word there that comes out of statute and within our ordinances. And you can look at the standards within that. It's not technically a public hearing, but I'm aware that there are several neighbors who may have some comments of interest for the Planning Commission should you choose to entertain that. And I'd be happy to take any questions myself as well. But we'll turn it back to you, Commissioner Sunlaw, for the floor.
Okay, so like Lyle said, this is not a public hearing. However, if we are looking at imposing conditions, I think, at least I'll speak on behalf of myself, it's nice to sometimes hear from, neighbors that can tell us things that maybe we're not aware of. So if you're here to talk about this, come up and we'll try to keep your comments brief, but tell us your questions or comments with respect to this conditional use permit. But before we do that, maybe, Lyle, I don't know if this being my maiden voyage, although I've been here for a lot of meetings, should we give the applicant an opportunity to maybe address things, or do we usually hear from people first?
Yeah, and I think, while we haven't officially passed the new bylaws, Mr. Summercorn, the current chair, I think is interested in that format. It may answer several questions that the neighbor have to solicit that information from the applicant, let the public speak, and then we'll often let them come back up to address concerns that they're likely more privy to than even we are as staff.
Yeah, so let's do that. So Mr. Parker, if he's here, come up and maybe address what Lyle said and maybe give us some more background. Then we'll hear from the neighbors, and then if we need to have more questions for the applicant, we can go from there. Is he here? Okay, so that makes it easy. Okay, so if anyone is here to comment on this, come up, state your name, and tell us your comments or questions.
Is this on? Okay, one of the questions I have...
What's your name?
Dale Maxfield. I live in the Circle. One of the questions I have, if this does pass, is he able to put another duplex on it? I'm hearing rumors that was his intention, is after he changes this, he wants to put another duplex on that property.
Well, I think I can answer that, or Lyle can. So my understanding is this is not what might be a rezone that would maybe allow something like that. This is the current zoning, and the zoning's not changing. It's asking for a conditional use under the current zone. So if this were granted, then he would only be able to do the 2 units here and no more. Lyle, you can correct me.
Does he have to live in the house, or can he rent both units out?
Yeah, I'll speak to both of those. So under the existing zoning, let everybody hear, hopefully. So under the existing zoning, they would not be able to do an additional duplex on the property. They may be able to subdivide it. I'm not certain on that with the square footage, but only a single-family home would be permitted within the existing zoning. So because it limits no more than 3 duplexes within 500 feet under that zone, even if you were to do a new building, this becomes the third duplex in the area, and there would not be others permitted. As far as occupancy of it, whether they live there and rent out the basement or they rent both upstairs and downstairs, we don't determine that. They're allowed to do either scenario. It could be a completely rental unit or owner occupied in at least half.
My biggest concern is I've spent a lot of money in the last 5 years on my house, bringing my value up and doing a lot of renovation to that, and that, doing a duplex at the end of that deal and not controlling what is in there or who's in there, will change the value of the house. The safety of the circle will change, all of it. It will. There's no way to look at that different. It just will change. It is a very safe, very secured neighborhood. We all know each other. We all watch each other's stuff. And if you bring in people that are renting, it just changes everybody's feel of what that property is. Nobody takes care of it like a homeowner.
My name is Grant Biesinger. I live in the cul-de-sac. So, question: I've heard or been told that if you have a basement apartment and you put that in for a mother or a close relative of that sort, that is automatically grandfathered in as a legal duplex. Can you speak to that?
I'll address that. So any home in Kaysville City that's a single-family designation can have a single family living in it, and the city's definition of that is anyone who's related by blood, marriage, adoption, guardianship. So it wouldn't necessarily be grandfathered, it's just simply permitted citywide. So if they are your family that's in that basement, then they're permitted there. Some people will have that with a separate entrance or second kitchen. Sometimes it's a typical house with one kitchen and one entrance, but they kind of live there as family. Yeah, there are all kinds of ways that you can divide up the actual structure, but so long as they're family, any one of these homes on this map and in the city could have a related mother-in-law scenario within it.
So does that affect the number of duplexes allowed in that 500-foot radius from the home or not?
It would not, because we do not consider those two-family dwellings. It's still only a single-family designation.
Okay. So in the agenda that was sent out for this, that was part of the city standards were quoted, 1738, and it's talking about that it must provide a use at the location that is necessary or desirable service that's got to contribute to the general well-being of the community and the neighborhood without effects on the health, safety, or general welfare of persons residing or working in the vicinity or injurious to property or improvements in the vicinity. So, I'm just going to kind of second what Dale has said on that with this rental property. What guarantees are there and what kind of qualifications does the applicant have to be able to properly manage a rental property that will be maintained, that is desirable, and how do you define whether that is desirable or not? Certainly I think the residents that are in the vicinity, everybody that I've spoken to does not consider it desirable as called out in the standards, nor do we think that it contributes to the general well-being of the community, and it definitely detracts from Utah's hometown as we know ourselves. So it'll be my recommendation that before any approvals are given on that Planning Commission look very closely at that standard that's quoted to us in the minutes or in the agenda that was given to us.
Okay, I'm Marilyn Kilpack, and I live 2 homes away from the corner. Anyway, 164 North 650 East. I oppose the conditional use permit for a 2-family dwelling because decreased property values, increased traffic in our cul-de-sac, lack of adequate parking, decreased safety for children in our cul-de-sac. There are 10 homes in the cul-de-sac with 11 children or youth. 3 youth 16 years or under, 8 children under the age of 5 years. Of the 10 homes, 8 have been in their family for 40, 50, or 55 years. So anyway, we're invested. These families take pride in our neighborhood. There are 4 homes that have mothers, mother-in-laws, or family that live or have lived with them in their home. There are obvious safety issues with the 188 North, 650 East location. Parking will be too close to the corner. The stop sign is right there. I don't know if that would have to be moved. There's a fire hydrant right there. I don't know if the water or the water pressure would be impacted if they put the driveway on that north side of the house. And snow removal, those are just a few of the safety concerns. Temporary renters are normally not as invested in the property. Drive around and look at some of the rental properties in the area. Just even on 2nd North where we're coming, there's quite a few. They're all overgrown. Not all of them, but quite a few. We don't want our corner to be like that. This permit would have a negative impact on every family or home in our cul-de-sac except one. This permit would also impact people from nearby neighborhoods that choose to walk their children in our cul-de-sac. A duplex or set of duplexes, which, like we've heard, that would be what he'd want to do down the road or whenever. He'd have to get different permission, but it would not be very welcoming to our neighborhood. I would invite you to drive through our cul-de-sac at 650 East 2nd North. Just get a feel for it, and you'll know why it's so important to us. And I don't know if any of you would really want to have a duplex right next to your home. Thank you.
My name's Kevin Collier, and I live across the street on the north side of 2nd North. And my concern is about safety. This is, I consider, a very dangerous street. We have several hundred 18-wheelers a day going up and down this street. It's on a curve, and you can actually only see about 50 yards in either direction. And this property is not fenced, and I just don't think it would be a suitable place for young families with children. That's my comment. Thank you.
Hi, my name is Heidi Naylor. I live at 153 North, 650 East, and I was born in that house. So I'm one of the longer-term residents there. My parents bought it. I was born there less than 6 months later. I lived my life on that street. I've raised kids on that street. I have put money into that property as my financial investment for the future. And I'm very concerned with property values. I've lived other places. My mom has always lived there until she passed. But I've lived other places, and I've seen what happens to property value when you start putting multifamily dwellings in the area. Families that typically live there are not as invested in the community or the property. They're renters. They come and go. And with rental prices in Kaysville, they would probably come and go faster because they're just looking to get into their own homes. That concerns me because it's a very safe neighborhood now. We are off the beaten path. That is a very long cul-de-sac. We used to call it the keyhole. That was the term for our cul-de-sac, and some of us longevity owners still use it. You can't really see what's in that street from 2nd North or really anywhere else. It's very safe. We all know each other. We watch each other's property. We watch and make sure each other's children are safe. And it's really hard to think of the turnover that you have and not knowing what's going to come in. And I know you can't always prevent that, but there are a lot of things that state care community-wise as far as I'm concerned. And my financial investment is a concern for me as well. Those are my main concerns.
Just a couple quick questions as well. Again, Grant B. Singer. I'm glad you changed that picture there. And I guess, first of all, thank you for being willing to hear us tonight, even though it's not a public hearing. Appreciate that. Question has to do with the sidewalk. You know, safety has been brought up a few different times. As you can see in that picture, the sidewalk ends where that proposed driveway is at. If this were to pass, would that sidewalk, I mean, as far as safety for travel along Second North, you can see there's nothing on Second North for that, and there's nothing all the way along that side of the street. So, I mean, is there any recommendations or requirements for them at that point to continue that sidewalk along the north side of that house? And how would that affect the amount of property they have to be able to divide that up? So I don't know. Speak to that for us real quick.
Yeah, so to the sidewalk question, typically what will happen as far as development through a subdivision process, if this lot were splitting and a new structure were being put on there, we would have through a subdivision process a requirement for that street improvement and the sidewalk. You'll see some of that with the other subdivision process this evening. So there are some processes where it's very clear, absolutely they would be required to put that in. In this case, it would, because they're not further developing the property, granted they're getting a conditional use permit for an extra unit, it would only be under a circumstance where the Planning Commission finds a nexus and deems that necessary to mitigate impacts from the impact of this proposal. So it could be a requirement of the Planning Commission if you find that necessitates it. Otherwise, it's not an outright requirement just based on their question.
Okay, thank you. I know that several of us have written letters. I don't know if there's a way to submit those to you guys for review, or is this just a public hearing where we just verbally communicate this to you?
So maybe I'll answer that. With respect to the letters and comments, before this meeting probably was that time. So if there's content in those letters or things that hasn't been said, now is the time.
Thank you.
Sorry, my name's Marilyn Kilpack, and I was going to say that as far as I believe that the public notice showed up in front of their house last Friday, the 20th, and I called on Friday and left a message, and so I received a call back Tuesday morning. So we really haven't had a whole lot of time to try to get all of our thoughts and everything together, but if we need to get signatures, we're there. We have a form, but just haven't gotten all that. We appreciate your time.
I'm Kenneth Needham. I live right next door to this owner, Bart. Over the time he's lived there, the conditions of the property have dropped. Overgrown lawn, or sprinklers flooding my house, flooding my garage due to this broken sprinkler. Damage to my vehicles. I'd like to submit those if you would like to see them. From his roofing, he failed to secure. And again, he damaged my car. You can see pictures, silhouettes of his truck in the side of my Z car, showing where he left his truck parked for a year unlicensed because it didn't run, killing the grass. So his idea of parking off the street in the wintertime is in the lawn. And again, overgrown grass, cutting things down, not taking care of his property. It doesn't get any better. These are his current constructions with debris in his driveway, a dead dryer in the backyard and mud, and just deleterious items everywhere. It's just a hole. And again, you can even see where his dead truck was. I don't see it improving anymore. Even if you get him a permit, he's not going to be there to take care of it. And it'll go downhill. I own that property, the adjacent property. My family's in the adjacent. I don't want him developing it any more than he is. Single family dwelling, keep it simple, have a nice place.
Thank you again for hearing us. I live right next door, 174 North, 650 East. My name is Becky Needham. I've lived there for over 17 years. When I first moved in that house, I was single. The neighborhood was very safe. I felt safe. I never worried about being there by myself. I was never concerned about safety. I think if that was turned into a rental property and they're renting out both units, there's going to be more crime in the area, and the people that are moving in and out are not going to be as careful or take care, have pride in the area. And I think the safety of all the children in the neighborhood would be at stake. We actually like the neighborhood so well, we moved my mother and father in next door to us because the neighborhood that they've been living in was going downhill because it's renters. Garbage in yards and crime. So we just don't want to see that happen here in this neighborhood. It's a great neighborhood, and these people are great to have as neighbors. Thank you.
My name's Karen Maxfield, and I also live in the Circle, and it is a wonderful, safe place to live right now. But we have had rentals, and when you're not invested in the property, you don't take care of usually the property. And we have had several people that we thought would be wonderful to take care of our place, and at the time we George, but my daughter lived around the corner, and if it hadn't have been for her, our yard would have been dead. The lightning struck a tree and busted a huge limb off of it. They wouldn't even take the limb off of the property. She had to come up and try and drag it off. The house wasn't taken care of when we came back and had them leave. We had to almost sandblast the bathroom shower because it hadn't been taken care of. Everything that they had done in the kitchen, it was drawing bugs because they didn't take care of the dishes. But I feel like you almost have to have somebody there that cares about that house to take care of it, because there's a lot of renters that probably do. But there's also a lot of renters that they don't have money invested, they don't have family invested in there, and they let it go, and they don't care. And if this family that's in there now moves and has 2 renters in there, they're not taking care of the yard and everything now. What's going to happen when they get 2 renters in there that aren't invested in the property? With the values of our homes, with the safety of these little children. The couple that live next door to us have 4 kids, and those little kids are safe at the end of that cul-de-sac. But with renters that are coming and going, there's going to be at least probably 4 cars. They don't have parking for 4 cars, so they're going to be parking in front of our homes. And you know how children are. They dart in front of cars. They don't understand. They're too young. We watch out for them. So I just hate to see the value and the safety of our little circle go. And nobody's here to even go for him, not even he is here. And he hasn't been straight with anybody, letting us know what's going on with his home. That is a very bad concern for me.
My name is Chris Titus. I'm here representing my parents, Barry and Carol Avery, who are residents of the cul-de-sac. My family moved into that cul-de-sac when I was 5 years old. My 90-plus-year-old parents still live there, and I'm in my 60s, so obviously have been personally involved in this neighborhood for a very, very long time. And I want to thank, from the bottom of my heart, the current residents who cared enough to show up tonight. And when they say they look out for each other, they aren't kidding, because my 90-year-old parents wouldn't be alive at 90 years old without a lot of these good people sitting right here. The neighborhood is a great one, and all anybody wants to do is make sure it stays that way. Safety is a huge issue, and I would respectfully request that at the very least a 2-scale drawing of what this plan really is be shown, because the way it appears now, there's going to be a driveway closer to a stop sign than you're legally allowed to park. This is a problem. So there are very, very valid safety concerns. The property value issues are real. And I think it's safe, and clearly we all share these same concerns because you're hearing them over and over. I think it's safe for me to speak for all of these good people in saying we all agree there is an appropriate place and an appropriate need for multifamily dwellings. But a 60-plus-year-old cul-de-sac of single-family dwellings is not one of those places. It just isn't. And I think if you kind of put yourself in the position that we're in right now, and it was happening next door to you, or your aging parents, or someone you love, I think you'd really take a hard look at whether or not that was something that would in any way add quality to where you live. And so I would just respectfully request that you consider that although you probably, well, not probably, you absolutely have the legal right to grant this permit, it doesn't necessarily make it the right thing to do. And I appreciate your time tonight. Thank you.
Okay, any other comments? I appreciate the comments, the things that are said. It gives us good context. So open it up to discussion or questions from the commission. Actually, let me just say something, and I should have done this to begin with. So with a conditional use permit, actually let's back up. So every zone, every residential zone or commercial or otherwise in Kaysville has permitted uses that are just listed out. There are things that you can do, types of land use in every zone that you can do without anybody looking over your shoulder, including the city. And then there are conditional uses in every zone. And conditional uses are essentially permitted uses that have impacts beyond regular permitted uses. And so a conditional use says, look, these uses are uses that we are prepared to allow in this zone, but we are going to have the opportunity as a city to impose conditions to address the negative impacts that might come from those uses. So what that really means is we as a commission don't have a whole lot of discretion. We have a little bit of discretion. This is not something like a rezone application where it's totally a legislative decision, and that means we get to do whatever we feel is best. This is not that situation. This is a situation where the decision in many ways has already been made for us The only discretion that we have is we have to say, what are the negative impacts that come from this, if there are any, and then what can we do to address those impacts? If we can impose conditions to address those impacts, then we, by law, have to approve this. We don't get the decision to deny it. Does that make sense? So that is the context of our discussion, and so many of the things that you said, we might agree with personally, or maybe we don't, I don't know, but some of the things that were said are valid concerns, but they are in many ways outside of the scope of our discretion. So I'll just preface that and let the discussion happen.
What is the ordinance as far as like how far the setback of this where they've, is that the red where they're proposing to put the driveway, the additional parking?
So the question is, what are the ordinances as far as setback or distance requirements from the property line? The ordinance requires is that from where the property intersects, and you can see a little bit on this drawing, it's not a true square. And so what we end up doing is just bringing those lines out further to where they would intersect, and 20 feet from that point is the closest point that a drive approach is permitted. I was checking based on the comment that was brought up from the neighbor. It looks like the stop sign sits right there at the end of that sidewalk. So roughly what that does is it allows for the length of one vehicle, a standard passenger vehicle, to pull up to a stop sign, and somebody could still get in and out of their driveway behind that, is more or less the basis behind that standard. Correct, this drawing is not to scale, so I don't know exactly where the driveway would sit in relation to that, but this structure itself is roughly 20 feet off of the property line to begin with, so they may have to jog their driveway to accommodate that, but I believe there are ways that they can get the drive approach outside of that 20 feet.
Okay, Lyle, I have a question. So in the description it says, the applicant is requesting approval to build a new two-family dwelling at the address. So if it's a new two-family dwelling, I'm just curious as to why it's not a rezone request.
Yeah, perhaps the semantics are confusing there. So they're not proposing to raise the structure and build a completely new building on site. They are simply looking to work on the basement to add an extra unit, is my understanding. The reason the rezone is not required is because the current zoning allows it. We called it a new one because right now it's considered a single-family dwelling. So by changing it, it is now a new two-family dwelling in this area. Hopefully that clarifies it. But again, the rezone is not necessary because the current zone permits it.
Okay,
A rezone would be necessary to do more than one duplex or something of that nature on the property. Sounds like is an idea that's been heard by the community.
Okay, and so then my next question is, since it's a conditional use permit, and then it says the applicant is looking to remodel, so since it's a conditional use permit, how do you, say it's granted and the neighbors are really upset and they're noticing things and it's causing problems and there are safety issues and all those things, and then they come in and they complain, then how is a conditional use permit on a duplex revoked or rescinded? I mean, how's that enforced, I guess is my question.
Great question. So a conditional use permit runs with the land. So if this property changes, no matter who the owner is or the occupants, it could continue to go with that. If they're outside of their conditional use permit parameters, then we could bring them into compliance. So once we set conditions, if they're abiding within those conditions, even if perhaps there are unforeseen circumstances or issues that arise from that, we'd probably have to, outside of a conditional use process, look at mitigating those. So we've heard trash or other things, the unruly state of the property. We have other ordinances that can deal with that, and so that heard, we can look into that, notwithstanding this whole issue. But that's my understanding that once we set conditions, as long as they're within those, then they can continue that. They start going outside of that, we simply need to bring them back into compliance with those conditions that run with that property. To lose a conditional use permit, essentially the use has to be ceased for a period of up to a year. So if once you modify a structure, it's difficult to track, but maybe an easy example would be if somebody was granted the ability to do an arcade downtown and that business left and a grocery store came for a year, well, the arcade's gone, and the next arcade that comes back would have to come back before the Planning Commission. But as long as this is continually used as a two-family dwelling and the structure exists in that state, it will probably continue to do that from here on without.
Even if they violated the conditions, is that what you're saying?
And if they continue to violate the specific conditions, so perhaps I'm not addressing your question directly, that could be cause for revocation of that conditional use permit. So if they've not upheld to, again, just the recommendation that parking on site and that parking is removed, yes, they are then in violation. It can come before the Planning Commission for consideration and revocation. So that's probably what the question was to begin with. But yes, if they go outside of what the parameters you set, they'll be back here before you for consideration on whether that continues.
Okay. I guess I'm just asking because I'm wondering if it's something that we, as Josh described, kind of have to grant. The only control we can put on it is just the condition. I guess we can just make really specific conditions. Is that what you're saying? And just make them.
Yeah, if you can tie the conditions to reasonably anticipated issues, and we put the conditions on that property and they're not abiding by those, then they could come back and have that revoked. But again, my take on it is if you don't place a condition on it and suddenly an issue happens, they're compliant with every one that you set, but something new comes up, they're still within the parameters that were set for them on their conditional use permit.
Okay, so at this point, having, for example, say we tabled it or something and had the applicant come in and he talks about what he wants to do, it's really not appropriate then because it's, or would it be?
It could be appropriate. So if you feel there are questions that you aren't able to answer or address that they would have additional information on or is needed, that is your prerogative as a commission to table that for additional information before you make a decision.
We don't usually do this, but I'm feeling super generous, I suppose. If you want to come up and make a comment, yeah, we'll hear from you. Because there's not very many of you, let's hear what everyone has to say.
Thank you. I appreciate that. And just listening to the discussion that just took place, and I appreciate your questions, can you tell us if there are currently any conditions to address the safety factor of that corner? And have actual measurements been taken to make sure there really is room to do what he's proposing? There's like two window wells on the north side of that house. The current driveway shows it bumping right up against the house, but you've got two window wells right there that project out, 3 feet or give or take? And if you have to put the driveway on the other side of those window wells, do you then bump up against that 20-foot line? Just curious as to, again, legally, can it even be done? Does it meet the requirements? And then the safety factor of the stop sign, where it's located, the parking issues that come with that. Are there conditions to address the safety issues, I guess is my question. Thank you.
I'll speak first off, Mr. Chair, to the distance question, I suppose. So the house itself is at least 20 feet from that property line, and that's just a setback requirement for the zone. So the structure we know is at least that far. The width of the driveway, I mean, it could be done a number of ways. It could be a 20-foot wide driveway. They'd be welcome to pave right up to the fence, or so to speak, right up to the property line if they chose to. It could be more narrow. So you could have a 10-foot wide driveway in that stretch. Again, you park in tandem, one person behind another. It could be wide enough side by side. And again, as to the frontage and the distance from the stop sign, simply just straight across from this home is 20 feet, and so you can see that there would be distance from the stop sign to accommodate that. The driveway may curl or curve. Technically, it's doable. So whether or not it's preferred or beautiful and those types of things, but on a technical basis, yes, I believe they could fit a driveway for 2 cars.
So looking here, your recommendations, Lyle, predicate on 2 points. First one is parking. You provide a minimum 2 parking stalls per unit in accordance with KCC 1732-5, no parking spaces required. And then the second one is driveway approach can be no closer than 20 feet to the point where the property lines will intersect at 650 East and 200 North Street per ordinance 32-2 off-street parking. So you're saying right now it meets those conditions.
His drawing probably doesn't with the detail that it is.
Got it.
But the conditions placed in there would require that anything implemented does follow that.
Thank you. Go ahead.
Now, in those conditions, does he have to have separate meters, separate utilities, separate heat, separate water, all those metering separate in the unit? As now, he has one air conditioner and one furnace for the entire unit. So that's not allowing for separate utilities for the upstairs and downstairs tenant. They also don't have separate water. If one gets turned off, something happens, the other tenant loses his functionality of utilities, then the unit's unusable, no utilities because they've been turned off. How does he address not having utilities for up and down?
So before, whatever the planning commission determines tonight, in a scenario where the conditional use permit is approved, before the actual change of occupancy can occur, they have to proceed through the building permit process to convert it from a single family to a 2-family occupancy on the dwelling. And that would require fire separation, certain utility separation, HVAC, vent system separation, egress, ingress requirements, and I probably can't name them all, but yeah, they would be required to go through a building permit process to do that. On a duplex, there are some provisions where not every utility necessarily has to be separated. Many will. A twin home, the side-by-sides, there's some different, a zero-lot line type scenario does have some distinct requirements that are unique to those. But hopefully that gets at least to the point that, yeah, they would have to go through a building permit and get approval, be inspected, and verify that all those items meet international residential code for the structure.
Was there one more comment?
This really isn't my favorite thing to do. There are 10 homes in the cul-de-sac. 8 of the homes are represented here, and he's not here.
So let me just offer some of my thoughts. Where do I start? Okay, so let me just give my thoughts on what, if this were approved, what would change. Like, so we're saying, again, I'll go back to what I said. If it's a conditional use permit, we're saying what are the detrimental impacts? In other words, what is changing? And can we address those by imposing conditions? So here are the things that I think are what's changing, and then maybe this would lead into a discussion of whether these are detrimental impacts or not. And then I want to just offer my opinion on the things that we can't consider despite the validity of them. So what's changing is there's going to be 2 separate families or occupants in this one structure. What I'm hearing is there's not, at least according to the drawings we have and what I've heard from what Lyle was saying, there's nothing that's really going to change necessarily from the outside of the building, of the home, other than a driveway, and then there's going to be access around the back. And if I look at those pictures, it looks like there's already a stairwell there. So from the outside, aesthetically, it's just going to be a driveway, which means there will be more cars parked on there. Then that means more cars will be there, at least probably 2. Certainly 1, probably 2, more, maybe more, but at least 2 I think we could assume. And then that driveway is close to 200 North. That is a change, and that is an impact. I mean, me personally, I'm struggling to find what are the other detrimental impacts that I think we should address. So then, okay, so I'll address the property value, and I'll at least give my opinion, and we can maybe differ, but, so property value and then other things related to it. So the rental aspect. So both with the conditional use permit and in many other considerations, it's not our, at least in my opinion, it's not within our purview to say whether someone can rent or not. Sometimes renters, I agree, don't take care of the property. Sometimes they do, maybe more likely they don't. It just depends. And we don't dictate necessarily as a city, and certainly in a conditional use permit, whether someone can rent their property out or not. Sometimes there's HOAs, and that's one of the beauties, if you want to look at it that way, of an HOA. An HOA says, look, we're going to get together and we're going to try to manage property values in the way we see fit, and we don't want renters in our HOA. That's one of the reasons why you have an HOA, because you get to control that kind of stuff. Many people think that's better made as a private decision and not a government decision. As a government, we don't decide what people can do in that way with their property. In a similar way, we don't also regulate, in many ways, aesthetics. So we don't say your house has to look this certain way. In some cities, they do. In Kaysville, we don't do that very much. We might say the height, very, very few things. The cleanliness of the property, whether the grass is mowed. All of these things, in my opinion, we can have a philosophical discussion about this, are not the role of government to dictate. They might be unsightly. We might not like them, and we might want them to change. But it's not the role of the government to dictate those types of things, and certainly not, in my opinion, in a conditional use application. Property value, so I'll just give you my thoughts on that. Property value, we're really talking about two different things, and we actually had someone come and speak to this as from the community come and speak to this several months ago. And property values are determined in two ways: appraised value and market value. Appraised value really only looks at comparable sales, recent sales. So they say, okay, what other homes in this given vicinity have sold that are similar to this one? They have the same square footage or similar square footage, similar bedrooms, similar bath, similar age of home. What of those homes sold in a recent time frame and what price? And then they average those or aggregate those and say, okay, this is the appraised value for this structure. In that analysis, very little is given to the cleanliness of the property or whether it's a rental or not or something like that. Market value takes those things a little bit more into